Welcome to the Humanist Perspective. My name is Nathan Bupp, Director of Communications for the Center for Inquiry and an Associate Editor of Free Inquiry magazine. We're talking today with Dr. Paul Kurtz. Paul Kurtz is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the State University of New York and the Chairman and Founder of the Center for Inquiry and the Council for Secular Humanism. Paul is the author of 45 books and literally hundreds of articles. He is a well-known lecturer worldwide. Paul, welcome to the Humanist Perspective.
Delighted to be here, Nathan.
You are also known as the father of secular humanism.
Perhaps the best term is the grandfather of secular humanism.
The grandfather of secular humanism. You are celebrating 80 years.
Yes.
You're in your 80th year, and I guess we could say this is the 80th year that you have spent in search of wisdom, humanistic wisdom.
Well, let's say at least 60 of those years searching for wisdom. Though actually I was interested in philosophy maybe from the age of 12 or 13, or philosophical, the deep questions all my life. Yes, and it's a surprise to me that I suddenly realize that I'm 80, because I don't feel 80. I may look it, but I don't feel it.
You exercise vigorously every day.
I've invented what I call aerobic walking and aerobic trotting, and I do that every day, the upper body and the lower body. So I really on the move all the time, and I've always have been. And people have asked me, well, if you had to live your life over, would you do it again? Yes, 1,000 times yes. I think that life is wonderful. It's pregnant with opportunities and possibilities, and there's so much that to experience and to enjoy in life. But what I'm concerned with is this question of wisdom. You don't hear much about that. And I think we need wisdom in our society. We need to reflect on where we are at the present moment.
Well, you have spent the lion's share of your career, Paul, searching for ethical alternatives to religiosity.
Yes, that's true. We live without religion. I draw upon ethics, naturalistic, on science and reason. And I think millions and millions of people live the same way without religion.
Yes.
In fact, in my view, the present age worldwide is a humanistic and a secular age.
Right.
And the deepest trends of development of change are humanistic and secular.
Well, I guess if we look at the two deepest streams in Western civilization,
Yes.
we have Athens and Jerusalem.
Yes.
Obviously, humanism harkens back to ancient Greece and Rome.
Yes.
And that represents one of the richest streams in Western civilization.
Yeah. It is the Greek or Roman influence going back to the Greeks and all the way through to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the democratic revolutions of our time in the present world that I draw upon. I'm not denigrating the Judeo-Christian, the books of Abraham, including the Islamic world. That's surely part of human experience. But I think that aspect looks back, whereas the kind of humanistic and secular point of view draws on other sources and it looks forward, not backward, for inspiration.
Well, I guess that leads into what I want to say next, and that is that you talk about the need for wisdom, and you spent your career as a professor of philosophy. Now, philosophy is obviously the love of wisdom, but you say that in the modern age we need to move beyond philosophy. We need to move to something that you call eupraxiphy.
Yes, eupraxiphy, that is the practice of wisdom. It's not only enough to be in the ivory tower, so-called, but you have to enter into the marketplace, the world out there, and practice wisdom. And I'm afraid that's one of the rarest commodities in the present world. You know, Nathan, I've lived 80 years, and I've 3/4 of a century of that was in the 20th century, from 1925. And the thing that surprises me is the lack of perspective. I'm known as an optimist, and I am. I lived through the Depression of the 30s, the Great Second World War, the victory of the Allies, the collapse of fascism, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the present wars in the Middle East. And there are Cassandras of doubt, always worried about the future. We've survived all of those things. And so I consider the human prospect positive, and we will prevail. Now, there are unforeseen events that may happen in the future. But the best way for the human species to prevail is to develop reason
Yes.
and critical intelligence and some wisdom.
Right. Well, you have often said that humanism is undergirded, that's a word that not everyone likes, but humanism is undergirded by three key virtues, and you've basically elucidated them as being courage, cognition, and caring.
Yes, in my book, The Courage to Become, cognition is first. That's reason. And we need to develop the skills of intelligence to deal with the world. Compassion or caring is second, not in order of priority. Care for the needs of others.
Right.
Altruism is essential to the human being, and I think it has biological roots.
Yes.
But then third, and maybe the most important, is the courage to
Right.
persist in the face of adversity and tragedy. So it's the courage to become that I think is fundamental, and particularly by the Cassandras that surround us, the naysayers and the doomsday.
Right.
And I look at them and they say, oh, things are terrible. The market collapsed today. It went down 10 points. We're facing a war in Grenada or somewhere else. And I say, try to take a broader perspective. Yes, there are difficulties. We've got to face them.
Right.
But so I have confidence in the ability of the human species to solve its problems and to persevere.
So I take it that you are a great critic of the so-called failure of nerve, which so many intellectuals exhibit.
There is, well, not only intellectuals, there is a failure of nerve, and it's very deep. And one of my indictments of religion is that it has lost confidence in the capacity of humans to deal with the world, to solve our problems.
Yes.
And it needs to look outward for divine sustenance and the hope of salvation in a mythological future. And I think we need to marshal our own resources out there in order to build a better world. And we can. And I think that's the history of the human species for the last 10,000 years.
Yes. One of the things that you have talked about a great deal in your work, particularly your work in ethics, is the fact that each of us needs to become who we are. You know, Nietzsche said, become who you are. And you talk about the fact that we have an opportunity to view our lives as a work of art.
Yes, I think every work of life and every career is a work of art. You only have one life to live. It's your life. My mother, who lived to 94, she had a good deal of common sense and wisdom. And she says, Paul, it's your life, it's your body, take care of it, fulfill it in your own terms, and don't expect others to do that for you. And so self-determination, the responsibility for your own future, is the power that we possess. And yet many people cave in with fear and trembling, and they want answers from authority figures. And so I think developing the courage to become what you want, marshaling your creative talents wherever you are, if you work in a factory or in an office, if you're an artist or a poet, if you're a scientist or an astronaut, if you're an ordinary person tending to your garden, I think this applies to everyone. The basic spirit of the human being is the creativity to find ends and goals and realize them, and that's the adventure of living.
You know, Paul, many religious existentialists have talked about the courage to be, but you move beyond that. You talk about the courage to become.
Yes, Paul Tillich, who was a great theologian, you don't hear much about him now, about 2 generations ago, talked about the courage to be, and I said, yes, that's important, but who wants to sit still? It's the courage to do, to act, to enter into the world, and to have your influence upon it, and yet as an active notion of becoming process.
Right. You know, a lot of these concepts that you talk about and have talked about throughout your entire career have been vindicated in the light of modern science. There's this interesting emergence of the science of happiness, and interestingly enough, what they find that is what the good life is about. The good life is about developing your capabilities as a human being, and it always amazes me that so much of this harkens back to Aristotle.
Well, I think Aristotle was a great thinker, but there are many others who draw from him through the history of thought. Yes, and so let us say for the secular humanists, the goal is happiness for the individual, and incidentally for the community and for others. With loving care, you want them to prosper and to become in their own terms. And so happiness is crucial in this world here and now, and I think it's within our capacity. And indeed, a majority of people in our society are happy. When you ask them on a poll, are you happy? They say yes. Or are the negative naysayers are always complaining? And so I'd like to look at the positive side.
You talk about Prometheus as a leading figure.
Yes, Prometheus inspired so many people, this titan mythological figure in ancient Greece. He did because he challenged the gods, he stole fire, and he endowed human beings with the arts of civilization. And so they can leave the caves of darkness and superstition, enter into the world, and change it. Yes, so Prometheus is a great mythological figure.
Now, I suppose when we talk about Prometheus, we're talking about the ideal of the life of active endeavor,
yes,
the strenuous life. What would you say to those who say that, no, the good life is the life of quietude and contemplation?
Well, that's a good point of criticism, and I think we need to meditate, and quietude and reflection is important. But human beings are not passive. I mean, they have to survive, they have to make their way in the world. Economic needs come basic. This was true of primitive human beings who had to protect themselves from wild animals and other tribes, and it's true even now. So I think, yes, pensive contemplation, but the active aspect of the human condition is essential to life. We're active, doing, transacting beings.
So, George Santayana said that the life of reason was achieving some kind of harmony. So I guess what we'd be talking about is some kind of a harmonious blend between the active Promethean life and the life of intelligent contemplation.
Well, I would go beyond harmony. And I think human beings may be bored only by harmony because it is enthusiasm. It's the game of life. It's adventure. And people climb mountains. They can stay home and be harmonious, or they go into the laboratory and make new discoveries, or create new plans and new corporations. So harmony and exciting activity. I use the term exuberance to express the capacity, particularly in modern affluent society, to lead an exuberant life.
Well, we've been talking largely about philosophy and philosophical wisdom, but one of the exciting things that we have at this time in history is the fact that we can move beyond philosophical wisdom and we can go to what you call scientific wisdom.
Yes, philosophical wisdom is not enough. It might have been in the days of Aristotle, although he was a great scientist in his own day. So I think that the frontiers of science are very, very important, and we ought to recognize that our knowledge of the world is tested knowledge confirmed by the methods of science. Drawing upon this, it becomes scientific wisdom as well as philosophical wisdom.
Yes, and one of the things that's very interesting when you talk about scientific wisdom is the fact that we have many different layers of knowledge that are available to us.
Yes.
We have psychology, we have sociology, we have biology. So you have talked about the concern that we don't fall into kind of a crude scientism or reductionism. You offer what's called a non-reductive materialism or naturalism.
Well, I use the term naturalism.
Naturalism.
And it's a pluralistic universe. And so there's subatomic particles and molecules and cells, organs, organisms, there are societies, there are planets, and there are galaxies. So the universe is really very rich in many kinds of things, and we have to leave room for that. It's not a non-reductive kind of conception of the basic parts of the universe. It's the universe as we find it, and that's a naturalistic universe.
So I think, as Carl Sagan said so eloquently, there is room for wonder in a scientific worldview.
Wonder is very important. The magnificence of the universe, the splendor of the universe. If I had to live my life over, I would be an astronomer maybe, contemplating the heavens. And the vastness of the cosmic scene is very important. I differ with our religious brethren or citizens in our society because they think the concept of God is all that you need, and I don't think that is a testable concept. So I want to deal with the real world as I find it and try to explain it, and we draw upon the sciences, and that is a source of wisdom. But it's not wisdom for its own sake. but wisdom that we should apply to life itself. So it is a kind of applied practical wisdom. I use the term eupraxiphy,
right,
as you pointed out, the application of this wisdom in order to achieve the good life.
Paul, there have been serious criticisms leveled against the humanistic worldview, as you're well aware of. On a more primitive side, we have suffered from the evangelical criticisms that, basically say we're ruining the culture, we're damned, we're going to hell. But there's a much more sophisticated critique, which has emerged from the neoconservative intellectuals and, men like Irving Kristol and others. And one of the things that they say is that science and reason might be able to analyze ethical codes, but they cannot deliver a code itself.
Well, I disagree with that. And I think it's possible to build secular ethics, and in fact, we have done that. For example, we share the civic virtues of democracy. Those are ethical principles and values, and our evangelical and fundamentalist friends also, insofar as they believe or participate in democracy, are drawing upon principles that are not found in the Bible.
And they emerge out of human experience.
They emerge out of human experience and human history, and I think the present world is basically humanistic. It's democratic. It emphasizes tolerance. It emphasizes individual human freedom as basic. And everybody talks about freedom, even though you don't find that in the Bible. You do not find freedom in the Bible, and surely not in the Quran. So then I think that there is a fund of moral knowledge that has evolved in civilization and is tested by its consequences and is constantly open to addition and modification, and that is widely shared. For example, the doctrine of human rights, universal human rights, is widely held. If you read them, that's a New Testament of living in a world community in which you respect the rights and needs of others, and that is a form of ethical wisdom, ethical knowledge.
Paul, how do we get around this charge that ultimately a humanistic ethics is based on relativism and subjectivism?
Well, I think that there's a difference between relativism and subjectivism. Ethics is relevant to human experience, human needs, and human interests. It doesn't exist in an ideal world. It is lived and practiced. But that doesn't mean it's subjective. There are these principles and values, and reason is able to modify them, and we can teach them to our young. I've used the term the common moral decencies.
What are some of those?
Telling the truth, keeping promises, being honest, being sincere, not harming others, being just. These are widely shared across cultures, religious and non-religious.
Paul, can we say that those are objective, though?
I think that they are general principles, and sometimes there are exceptions made to them, depending upon a conflict. But yes, I think they're objectively grounded in human experience. And if you consistently lie, not tell the truth, or break promises or contracts, then society will break down. So you test them by their consequences in the world, so that though relative to the human species on a planet Earth, nonetheless, they can be objectively tested. You know, Nathan, before we talked about happiness for the individual, and that is basic, but humanists also emphasize our responsibility to others. So the common moral decencies focus on that. I think that perhaps the principle that I would most want to suggest is a goodwill. We want to have a goodwill towards others.
Yes.
You find this in Immanuel Kant.
Yes.
Towards ourselves.
The categorical imperative.
It's a categorical imperative, yes. But I don't think it's categorical.
Right.
But I think it's a product of human wisdom that we ought to have a positive attitude towards others and try to be good towards them. Not out of self-interest, though that's important.
Right.
But out of a kind of altruistic regard for the needs of others.
Yes. Well, you've talked about the importance of lust and love, and that's a very important part of life.
Well, lust, you mentioned lust. Lust is part of life, yes. Sexual passions are part of who and what we are.
Yes.
And the effort to repress sexuality, to dam it up, has disastrous consequences. But in a wholesome context, so that I think loving relationships is very important in human experience. And the humanist believes in reason, but we also emphasize the importance of affection, of love, of other regarding feelings towards other human beings.
Absolutely. And so this means that although we believe in the happy life, the life of love and lust and, living it up within reason, that doesn't mean that it's anything goes. There are standards.
No, it's not subjective. And some people think that, well, anything goes, but this is the leaking flesh pot or the promiscuous life.
The life of the voluptuary.
The voluptuary, yes. And we ought to enjoy life, I grant, but I think balance and temperance, and the humanist philosophers have always said that.
Yes.
You need balance and temperance.
John Stuart Mill made it very clear in his classic Text Utilitarianism about that.
Yes. It's, we want to develop the higher pleasures as well as the lower pleasures, namely the intellectual, aesthetic, and moral pleasures, as well as the physical pleasures, which are basic and we should not suppress. So in a balanced life, you develop them all. In an exciting, adventurous life, you try to enjoy the full range of experiences. I sometimes use the term the fullness of life.
The fullness of life, yes. Or exuberance, you love that term.
Exuberance, yes.
Right. Well, as some of our viewers may know, Free Inquiry magazine is of course published here at the Council, and you contribute every issue a special editorial.
Yes.
And I have been privy enough to see the next editorial upcoming, and one of the things that you talk about is the importance for developing alternatives to religion, and you emphasize the need for poetical and aesthetic
alternatives. Well, as I've said, the lion's share of my career has been whether or not we can find an alternative to the religions of our day, and particularly the fundamentalist religions of our day, which are very evocative and very expressive and concern many people because it affects them. And are there other alternatives to good life? And so I think the answer is yes, there are. And historically, you had philosophical, scientific, and ethical alternatives. But although that's important, you need the aesthetic component, as you point out. You have to blend reason and emotion, cognition and feeling, in order to achieve the full life. It's the fullness of life of the whole person that we want to focus on, yes.
Right. Of course, you had those who said that it was mainly the aesthetic life that mattered, people like Walter Pater and Bernard Bergson.
They were the aesthetes.
The aesthetes, yes.
Emphasizing the aesthetic pleasures, and that's part of a good life. But I think the full life involves the enjoyment of a wide range of pleasures and activities, and not limited only to aesthetic pleasure.
What do you say to those who say that we've lost high culture, that our society is drowning in banalities?
Well, that may be true, and surely in terms of this mass television, cinema, process culture, but nonetheless, I think there are more symphony orchestras in the United States and throughout the world, and the opportunities for high culture. We have great universities, and there are great writers, and we still publish books. So I'm not a Cassandra of doom. I think in one sense education is universal worldwide.
Right.
And I think we ought to be thrilled that in the 20th century there's been tremendous progress, not only medical technology, which has extended life and provided consumer goods, has liberated women from the bane of housework because she has modern appliances and opportunities for careers.
Yes.
But maybe the most important thing of the 20th century is the development of education.
Yes.
The expansion of education, the recognition for American poor kids, for people in India or China or Africa, everywhere. Everyone realizes we have an obligation to get rid of illiteracy.
Yes.
And to offer the opportunities for education to everybody on the planet.
You said once that skepticism and critical intelligence was the ultimate mark of the educated mind.
Well, it's essential to be willing to reflect and not swallow hook, line, and sinker what a politician or a preacher or a used car salesman has to sell. And so you have to have some skepticism, but it's not sufficient. You need critical thinking, but you need some values. And there are norms and values that you discover in human experience. So you want to read people who have advocated them, and there are many. But you want a life of excellence, in my view, a life in which the qualitative characteristics of a good life, well lived, can be realized. And I'm shocked by the constant attack on secular humanists by certain fundamentalists in our culture who think that we denigrate the life of the humans. And I say we herald and celebrate the life of humans and want to live richly a good life, but that education and knowledge is very important. And every child should have the opportunity to be exposed to all points of view.
We've been talking about humanist ideals.
Yes.
In closing, you've talked about the need to institutionalize these ideas.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's one thing to advocate ideas, but I think we need to build new institutions.
Ideas have consequences.
Indeed, they do, and they will die out and be forgotten unless they are continued in the future. So in the United States, we have a constitution. We've developed institutions to present the ideals of the Enlightenment and of the democratic society. But I think secularism needs to be institutionalized, and we need centers and organizations which will cultivate the view, confidence in the human being and the ability of humans to solve their problems, confidence in the power of education, and also in the ability of human beings to find a significant, meaningful life without drawing on the past, religions of the past, but drawing on the best knowledge and looking ahead to the future.
And that's exactly what we're doing here at the Council for Secular Humanism and the Center for Inquiry. We are institutionalizing these great ideas as kind of a think tank.
Yes, yes, we are a think tank, and I think that's important, a secular think tank. But we're also developing communities and centers everywhere throughout the world.
There is a need for community.
There is a need for community. Ah, yes, important. The values of community. The individual cannot live alone in isolation, but needs to share values and ideals with others. And I think the secular and the humanist outlook is positive, affirmative, is pro-human. It wants to realize life to the fullest, and that's an ideal that needs to be cultivated in the future.
Well, we've been reminiscing about the fact that you're in your 80th year, and one of the things I wanted to talk about is I wanted to take you back to the 1950s.
Ah, yes, the 1950s.
You're at that prestigious institution, Columbia University, working on your PhD.
Yes.
And you are literally surrounded by intellectual giants.
Yes, incidentally, Eisenhower was president of Columbia University at that time.
Yes.
And I would walk across the steps of Lowell Memorial Library to go to the philosophy building, and sometimes I'd almost collide with him. But and he was a very kindly man, and very well liked as the commander-in-chief of the Second World War. But there were great intellectuals there. The students of Dewey. In fact, John Dewey has had a commanding influence on American life and still does today as a great philosopher. And many of his students, such as Ernest Nagel, John Herman Randall Jr., Charles Frankel, and Sidney Hook, who had studied with him and went on to be professor at NYU. So, yes, I was very steeped in reading, and I spent a delightful 3 years in studying at Columbia University at that time.
I guess you're considered a protege of, and your closest intellectual friend was Sidney Hook.
Sidney Hook, yes, professor of philosophy at New York University, where I took my bachelor's degree, and we had been in contact over the years. He's been dead now for at least a decade, but he was a remarkable man attempting to apply philosophical and ethical knowledge to the marketplace of ideas. And he was appreciated by all sides,
yes,
by the conservatives and liberals, the reactionaries and the radicals. And he was it was very difficult to define him.
Yes.
But he was committed to what he said was the method of intelligence and the need in a democracy to educate students so they would know how to think. That he got from John Dewey, but he applied it with tremendous virtuosity.
Right. He was a great polemicist, and along with the great Lionel Trilling, I'd say Sidney Hook was probably the most famous member of the so-called New York intellectuals.
A New York intellectual mafia, as they were uncharitably called. But he was very critical of communism. Although he began as a Marxist, he ended up by being perhaps its leading intellectual critic. And there are many others who fit into this category, such as Eastman and
Chambers and
well, Chambers, yes, but he wouldn't fit into the category of intellectual. But so Hook led a generation. He was a democratic socialist. He'd been accused of being a neoconservative. In his later life, he was a social democrat.
Right, a social democrat. I think one of the things that's interesting in reminiscing about Hook is part of the New York intellectuals. So many of his friends and colleagues over the years they went into a rightward shift, and they of course they founded neoconservatism. Sidney remained true to secular humanism throughout his life.
Yes, he was a founding editor of the Free Inquiry magazine and had contributed during his life. He was non-religious. Indeed, he was an atheist. He rejected belief in God, but he affirmed very deeply the capacity for achieving the good life, and he was especially committed to the democratic philosophy. And the thing that intrigues me today is in the 40s and 50s, many conservatives were opposed to democracy. They said America's a republic, it's not a democracy.
Right.
But he said consistently, what we have is political democracy, the right of opposition, an open society in which dissent is essential, and which the electorate plays a key role. And the interesting thing is that he converted so many conservatives. So even now, George Bush and many others talk about democracy. And I'm surprised and pleased to hear that about human rights, because it shows that ideas have consequences. And so the point I would make is that many conservatives are now humanists. They're democratic humanists. They're secularists in an important sense. And I think we always have to find common ground, and particularly now in our society.
Paul, you and Sidney are what could be called public intellectuals. Now, public intellectuals once were great generalists who surveyed the scene and took a scientific, philosophical approach. That seems to be disappearing in our society.
Some people have said, yes, that is the case. We live in a media culture, an internet culture, in which process information is ongoing. It's the glimpse that you see of an image and the soundbite. And so it's a decline of reflection in one sense, and that's deplorable. And so I do think we need public intellectuals. We need to hear different points of view, and not simply the so-called commentators or political savvy artists on television, but deeper, profound understanding.
It really is disconcerting, because in a sense we've not only lost the idea of the public intellectual, but we've lost the forum for the public intellectual. I mean, remember the days when one could tune into the Dick Cavett show and see a debate between William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal.
Yes, I've been on both the Buckley and the Cavett show in the past.
Right.
And we did have debates, and you see them. I go to Europe a great deal, and you see on French television or English television, the BBC, or in Germany, you see that opportunity, but it's being lost in America.
Well, in America, it seems like they scream at each other.
Well, with cable television, it's breaking news, and never mind breaking news. Let's hear some reflective interpretation of what's happening with a more profound focus. I think that's important.
It seems that if Americans only respond to sound bites, they can't really develop an intelligent appraisal of what their government is doing.
Yeah. Well, we have great newspapers such as the New York Times.
But readership is declining.
Readership is declining, yes, and that's one of the great problems of newspapers and magazines. And as the internet world is upon us, and we scroll, but we ought to think.
Absolutely.
That becomes very important.
The reflective mind.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, as a public intellectual, I think the thing that you're probably most proud of, I know it's what has impressed myself the most, is the fact that you have basically been the leading intellectual who has articulated the new paradigm, which you consider to be secular humanism, and you've drawn together many disparate elements of secular humanism, and you've laid out a platform.
Yes, there is a new paradigm, and the new paradigm must include science as an essential part of that. We have many poetic and literary approaches to reality and many religious approaches drawing upon the Bible.
Right.
But what's basic? It's the scientific revolution that is ongoing, that's been going on for 5 centuries and has transformed the globe. And unless you take into account what science says about the nature of the universe and the nature of human beings, then you lose so much. So there is a new paradigm, Nathan, as you point out. I call it the secular humanist paradigm. And I think it provides a comprehensive outline and a kind of, if you will, unification to provide a point of view that people can hold on to and apply.
Well, you laid out this paradigm elegantly in the Humanist Manifesto 2000, and one of the key points that you brought out in the manifesto was that secular humanism was committed to scientific naturalism.
Yes.
And one of the lines in there that you have that I think is very interesting is you say that secular humanism enables human beings to construct a coherent worldview disentangled from metaphysics or theology and based on the sciences.
Yes, and what disturbs me today is that so many of our political leaders look back to theology and metaphysics, and they don't really drink deeply at the well of scientific wisdom, and I think they need to. So the first principle of secular humanism is an appreciation for the methods of science. I mean, that's the first point.
It's a method of inquiry.
It's a method of inquiry, and it's a method of testing truth claims. And our most successful advances in the natural sciences, the biological sciences, the social sciences, in understanding the world and ourselves, is applying this rigorous method of inquiry, and it applies everywhere on the planet. Anyone can take part in that adventure. Yeah, so that is the first key point. But now there's a second point, scientific naturalism.
Yes.
And that's very controversial.
The cosmic worldview, as you call it.
It's a cosmic worldview, and people, supernaturalists, are skeptical about that. I welcome skepticism. But the cosmic worldview is this. We have a body of knowledge that has been growing and developing. Our great universities are teaching this knowledge. Our encyclopedias online now are making this available. And what does that say? It says, look, you ask what is reality, go to the sciences and draw from them. E.O. Wilson, a colleague of mine, a secular humanist, famous professor at Harvard, has introduced the term consilience.
Yes.
Yes. Can we bring together a picture? Well, we have done so. Yes. It's not the ancient picture in the Quran and the Bible, doctrine of creation. It's a universe in which the laws of physics and chemistry apply, in which there is evolutionary processes everywhere, an expanding universe in which there are vast galaxies, and interestingly, the most exciting discovery, in my mind, the last 5 years, is the discovery of 195 new planets outside our solar system.
Tremendous.
So this cosmic perspective of science, and also we now have a clear account of the history of the human species, which evolved in Africa, and the fact that we began in Africa, and Homo sapiens moved to Europe, to the Middle East, to Asia, to Australia, and over the Bering Seas to North and South Seas to North and South America. So this grandeur of this picture of the universe expanding and of the human species as part of nature, that is so impressive. And it's been tested by rigorous experimental methods, and the public doesn't fully appreciate that. They read it, but so many people have not imbibed this dramatic new view of the universe that now is with us in the 21st century.
Right. Well, perhaps the scientist who liberated us as human beings the most was the great Charles Darwin.
Yes, of course, and very controversial.
Yes, it
I'm
definitely.
sorry to say, it's a shock to me that Darwin is rejected in so much in the United States. He's accepted almost everywhere else in the world, except possibly not in the Muslim world,
Right.
but in secular countries, from Japan and China to Europe. Darwin, his principles of natural selection, are powerful principles for understanding how life changes through time by means of natural selection. And but why people should reject that is really very sad, given the fact that the United States is a great scientific, technological nation.
Right.
Yes.
Well, Darwinian evolution is the single organizing theory of all of modern biology, and interestingly enough, it's becoming an organizing theory of even psychology now, with
Yes, indeed.
evolutionary psychology and so many different
Anthropology,
fields.
but also the natural sciences. You could not understand geological changes in the physical sciences or the birth and death of planets and of galaxies without this notion of change. So
Yes.
change through time is an essential feature of the universe.
So a commitment to scientific naturalism is number 2. What is number 3?
Number 3 is we are skeptical about traditional religious claims. Now, we respect and honor the right of people to believe whatever they want, but many scholars and scientists have studied the ancient documents, and they're skeptical about the claims of a divine source of creation. We tend to be non-theists. We don't accept that God is a person. Atheists. There's insufficient evidence for belief in God. Agnostics. I use the terms we're skeptical about the claims of the Bible and the Koran, and the view that there is a source of all being.
Yes.
Find insufficient evidence for that.
You have said that you prefer the term skeptic in religion to kind of the negative connotation of just simple atheism.
Well, I mean, I'm an atheist and have never denied that, but I think that, unfortunately, the A word is like the E word, evolution.
It's a very loaded word.
It turns people off. But the reason why I don't use atheism is because it doesn't suggest the fullness of this new paradigm. I think secular humanism does do it because it moves on to the 4th point, which is humanistic ethics.
Ah, yes, the ethical point of view.
Ethical point of view, namely attempting to use knowledge and science and reason and experience to test moral claims. And there's a whole fund of ethical knowledge that humankind shares. And it is not derived from theology.
Right.
It's derived from human experience.
It's a commitment to the good life here and now.
Commitment to the good life here and now, and what can we do to improve the conditions of life. And the whole of science and the helping sciences are to improve the human condition so that we can be happy, to improve health, nutrition, and to get rid of poverty. And yes, and that is positive, humanitarian, humanistic, ethical.
Now, in this ethical point of view that you articulate, you talk about 2 constructs. You talk about the common moral decencies, and then you talk about the ethical excellencies.
Yes, the common moral decencies cuts across, and we share with Muslims and Jews and Christians and Hindus, basically, so many of the common moral decencies. They're the heritage of human civilization.
And tested in human experience.
Tested in human experience. There are differences, and we dispute them, but there is a common fund of day-to-day operations in which these moral principles apply. But the excellences, I think, are very important today. Humanists believe in individual freedom. Allow each person to determine his or her lifestyle. Do not repress individuals so long as they do not harm others. And this is particularly true in the field of sexual morality. It's true in the field of medicine. Informed consent depends upon the individual. The individual is being treated, and you should decide whether or not you want this treatment. It applies to the end of life, and so humanists have defended the right to die with dignity and so on. So we believe in individual freedom and the right of the individual to determine his or her own life. But I also submit we believe in excellence It is not life of promiscuity where anything goes.
Right.
We believe in the positive qualities of the good life well lived, and the whole of education. The greatest student, excellent. In sports, excellent. In music, excellent. So we want to develop excellence in our personal lives as well. And that's dignified and noble.
It's the refined character, in a sense.
It's refined quality of life.
Right.
Yes, we don't denigrate anybody, and there's wide diversity in tastes and pleasures. But nonetheless, even if you're in your own life, whatever you do, you want to achieve within your own terms some creative models of excellence. And that's a moral principle.
That moves into number 5, which is kind of a political platform or a social polity.
Yes, obviously, we have to be concerned about applying reason to the social political realm. And there, the humanists have been in the leadership of defending democracy. And I think that the ideals of democracy do not come out of the Quran, surely, and they don't come out of the Old or New Testament, only in a very extenuated way, because they focus on these virtues, civic virtues of the democratic society. Namely, we're against repression by church or state. We don't want repressive governments. We want democratic governments in which the people, we the people, says the Constitution, shall decide. And as Democrats, we believe in the separation of church and state.
Right.
That is the noblest principle of the American Constitution,
Yes.
implied or stated in the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Under heavy attack today.
It's under heavy attack today, unfortunately, because you can see what happens if you have a theocracy,
Yes.
as the great battle in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan with theocratic governments. And so our great founding fathers, Jefferson and Washington and Madison and others, believed in the separation of church and state. We shall not establish a religion. Yes.
Paul, early on in your career, you seemed to believe that you could tie the idea of humanism to a particular party platform, but you say as you grew older you felt that it was almost apolitical? Or?
Well, I think obviously as citizens we have to be interested in politics, and we have an obligation to take part. But humanism is broad enough to include many points of view on the political sphere, about taxation or about candidates. But so our position is the moral position. We need to take moral positions, and it's very important.
We have some humanists that are libertarians,
Yes.
some that are conservative, some that are Clinton Democrats.
Yes.
There's a broad spectrum
A
there.
broad spectrum, and if you look worldwide, there are social democrats in European parties who differ with the libertarians about economic policies.
Right.
It's interesting that many of the leading thinkers of democracy, Locke, John Stuart Mill, and in the 20th century, Sir Karl Popper, John Dewey, Sidney Hook were defenders of democracy. And I'm pleased today that in America, people on the right, as well as on the left or the center, believe in the principles of democracy. Tolerance, compromise, negotiate differences peacefully, a free, open society in which dissent is respected. We're worried about whether Mr. Bush at this time is undermining democracy, but he says he believes in it, in theory, if not in practice.
In theory, at least.
But that's important to get belief in principle.
You know, a recent book that caused quite a stir was Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat.
Ah, yes.
And he argues that we're facing a situation where economically, in trade, everything is basically flat. And this leads to what you would call your sixth point,
Yes.
number 6, and that would be the concern for a planetary ethic.
Planetary ethics is now the new moral principle that I think all members of the human family need to work toward. I think now for the first time, communication in the 20th century, 21st century, is instantaneous. And immigration, emigration, travel, so that we're one world, as Wendell Willkie, that Republican candidate in the 40s, said, we're one world. But we're more than that. We're a planetary community. And the rapid change that is occurring disturbs many people, but yet is changing the planet. We trade. The United States depends upon China, and China depends upon other parts of the world. And so we're all part of the same economic system now.
Yeah,
The free market, system is very important.
We're facing a time where globally there's interdependence between all of us now.
There's global interdependence. If you go back 500-600 years ago, cultures in South America or Africa would grow up independently, if you will, of what happened in Europe or America. But now there's economic interdependence, but more important, there's cultural interdependence.
Yes.
And what is emerging is not Western civilization or Eastern civilization or Islamic civilization or Christian civilization, but world civilization, a planetary civilization. But have we developed the ethical principles appropriate to that?
That transcend all these civilizations.
Yeah, and transcend them.
Right.
And I think the world is still confronted by this question of violence. Nationalistic countries contend with armies, so we have violent wars, racial differences and racial hatred, ethnic differences, as in the Yugoslavian cataclysm, religious differences. So it's important that we transcend national, racial, religious, ethnic differences and find common ground. That's why I've enunciated what I consider to be planetary ethics. We're citizens of the planet Earth, and we must recognize that.
It's really a hot topic in America right now.
It is, but I'm amused when people say, well, this is a Christian nation or a Judeo-Christian nation, because the first settlers came from England on the Mayflower. I just came back from the Alaskan cruise within the last 3 weeks, and we saw the melting glaciers, but also not that far from the Bering Straits.
Oh, yes.
And it's interesting, and I had a chance to meet some Native Americans in Canada. The first Americans were from Mongolia and China. They were pagans. They were not Christians. And they got here 10 or 15,000 years ago, and they populated North and South America and built great civilizations and noble tribes, which often contended as we contend in the Western world. So that point then is clear that America is a universal culture, because every racial and religious and national ethnic group has come here, and after the first Indians, then the people from Western Europe, Africans who were brought on slave ships. Every nation is represented in America. So we're the land of immigration and emigration. There have been waves of this from the beginning, and so we have to appreciate that. In one sense, we're part of the planetary community.
Yes. We only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask you about something that you've recently discovered in your studies that I know was very moving to you, and that was the idea of the genetic makeup of the human race, and you've discovered that it's all one.
It's all one. Population statistics and paleontology and genetic studies can show that you can mark the same DNA. So there are no separate races.
We're all part of
one human family, and therefore the basic first principle of planetary ethics is that we ought to treat every person on the planet Earth as equal in dignity and value. We should not consider them to be Americans or French persons or Ethiopians or Koreans, but all part of the human family. And our obligation and duty to others should be of central concern. We have to work out institutions in which we can live together peacefully. Above all, protecting our earthly habitat. Going to Alaska and seeing the melting glaciers and global warming is very shocking to me and to others who went on this cruise. So we have to be concerned with our planetary habitat at the same time.
Very well stated. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz, for joining us for this.
Thank you very much, Nathan.